Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 34 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, first off, I'd like to welcome those of you who are new subscribers from Tips from the Top Floor. If you heard my guest host appearance on Tips from the Top Floor and liked what you heard and came over here and checked me out over here at Camera Position, I appreciate that. And also, I would like to thank John Arnold for making a special mention of Camera Position in his marvelous photowalkthrough.com podcast. And again, those of you who are listening to Camera Position and haven't found some of these other photography podcasts, I would certainly encourage you to take a look at the photocastnetwork.com website, photocastnetwork.com, and you will find a variety of really terrific podcasts. I know that I have certainly found some interesting bits and pieces that I would not have expected to have found without having gone to the Photocast Network. So do take a look at what Photocast Network has to offer. Aberian X Perillo's Candid Frame, 2-Minute Photoshop Tricks, The Radiant Vista, Martin Bailey Photography's podcast, and of course Tips from the Top Floor. And, there are some great pieces of content out there, and I would certainly encourage you to take a look at those. Also, I'd like to thank those of you who have written in. I have tried over the last week or so to get back to just about everybody who has written to me, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the podcast, but also taking the time to write a note and let me know that you're out there. And I'm always really interested in knowing who people are and where they are and where they're listening to Camera Position and what they're getting out of this content that I'm putting up here on the internet. So in a past Camera Position, I had talked about the idea of putting together a portfolio of images, and I had alluded to the idea that one of the things that I would do at a future time would be to spend some time talking about the idea of sequencing photographs and the way in which sequence really changes the way we see photographs. Here's the way the great photographer Minor White said it. He said, "A sequence of photographs is like a cinema of stills. The time and space between photographs is filled by the beholder, first of all from himself, then from what he can read in the implications of design, the suggestions springing from treatment, and any symbolism that might grow from within the subject itself." So there's Minor White talking about the idea of how important it is to think about sequence and order of photographs. So what I'd like to do here is spend a little bit of time talking about how individual photographs, when placed in a grouping, really can change the way we perceive the images that we're looking at. And again, it's a little difficult to do this through the internet because I think one of the best ways to show how this works is literally to have some photographs in front of you, physical objects, and be able to move them around, shuffle them around on a physical surface like a tabletop. And if you are playing from home here and you're interested in trying to do this, I think probably the best way to do this is just to get yourself some prints of the images that you want to work with and begin to move them around physically in the physical space and rearrange them first, second, third, fourth, or however many you've got. It certainly is a lot easier, I think, to do that than to do it even in a piece of software like iView Media Pro or Photoshop's, Adobe's Bridge software or Adobe's new Lightroom software or Apple's Aperture or Portfolio or any of the other tools that are out there that allow you to rearrange images in a group. Somehow the actual physical activity of touching the images and moving them proximitously to one another really makes a big difference. So I would certainly encourage you, even if you just need to print out a quick draft copy of something to be able to use to sequence these images, I think that you'll find that physical movement of the pictures across a tabletop surface or the floor or whatever it is that you're working on will really help quite a bit. Even pinning them up to a pinnable, tackable surface on the wall will help quite a bit as well. So what I've done here is I've put together a couple of sequences of images to try and get at the idea of what I'm trying to express here and what I'm trying to explain about how sequencing of pictures works. So let's just kind of go through these couple of sequences and we'll see if we can figure out how to make this work in a linear fashion here on the Camera Position podcast. I will, of course, put these images on cameraposition.com on the blog entry for this particular episode so that those of you who are listening to Camera Position and can't see the enhanced podcast content can take a look at what we're looking at. So let's start out with an image that I made in Tuscany of this window in the Castello Broglio. Any of you who are Chianti fans will know Broglio. It is a remarkable Chianti wine, and here is a window from that estate. And I was really intrigued by not only the vines on the wall and so forth, but I really loved this sort of rosette window and the shape that created and the sort of marvelous dark aperture that was in the center of this particular window. Now, next to that picture, what I'd like to do is place this one, an image made not only miles away, but also years away, a photograph of the facade of a cathedral in Perugia in Umbria, Italy. And in this particular picture, I am really kind of intrigued by the idea that the shape, while not nearly the same exact shape as the one from the previous image, certainly echoes the idea of that image's structure and the way in which that window shape and this shape of the cutout in the facade have a real common sort of feel to them. And now in the third position, I'd like to include this photograph made again miles away and years away, this time in the town of Ascoli Piceno in the province of Le Marche, or the Marches, which is, by the way, just a terrific place to visit in Italy because it's not often visited by tourists and is quite beautiful. It is on the Adriatic coast, the east coast of the peninsula. And this particular picture really intrigues me because of the way in which the circular shape of the clock mimics some of that circular shape that we were talking about in the previous two pictures. I'm also intrigued here by how the aperture that is created by the archway of the little patio really kind of mimics the idea of that aperture in the original photograph, the first photograph of the window in Castello Broglio. So there is this way then of not only combining shapes, but also values and referencing values from one image to another. Moving along to yet another photograph, this one made, again, a long distance and a long time away from the other images. And the idea here that round shape, the round shape of the clock face, and the other sort of round-ish shapes that we've been looking at in the other photographs is mimicked here by this absolutely beautifully perfect sphere. And the way that sphere really captures the idea of the perfect roundness and the shadow on it really giving the sort of, it's almost an illusion of depth and dimension in the photograph. And then, moving on to the last photograph in this sequence of 5, is this photograph of a sphere-like object that instead of being perfectly spherical is faceted. And for me, it's those facets of the object that link me back to the first photograph, and the first photograph's idea of a circle, but a circle that has in a sort of an irregular circular shape to it. And so here we've tied a group of photographs together by the idea of shape. And just as importantly, I wanted you to get the idea that it doesn't necessarily have to be that a sequence of photographs comes from the same place or the same time or even the same exact sort of subject. And in fact, that idea of not the exact sort of subject brings me to this next and somewhat briefer sequence of just 3 photographs. And let's take a look at how this idea of sequencing can work here instead. Here's a photograph of a Bernini sculpture from the Ponte San Angelo, the Angel Bridge in Rome. Of course, a bridge just lined with these marvelous Bernini angel sculptures, each one symbolizing a certain idea or concept. And I've always loved the bridge, of course, and I've always very much loved this photograph because of the way it captures this sort of mood. It was shot early in the morning. The sun is coming up literally right behind the sculpture. I've positioned the camera in between, or rather positioned the sculpture in between the sun and the camera. And the idea here of this mood and this sentinel sort of standing all by itself in the misty, moody morning sky. So the idea here of one singular object standing alone. And what I'd like to do in the sequence here is contrast that with this photograph of a lone cypress tree standing against the sky as seen through a kind of a moving mask in a way of other trees. And the idea of a lone sentinel begins to me to become a sort of thematic idea. Certainly the tree is not a sculpture, but instead is this object placed probably by someone who planted it very carefully out in the distance to be able to be seen from a distance. This marvelous exclamation mark in the distant sky, and to me it seems rather somber. I think partly because when I made this photograph, I blurred, or rather used a long enough shutter speed to allow the wind moving the trees to blur the foreground trees a bit. And there is this sort of somber quality, I think, to this photograph, even though the light that is falling on the tree in the background is quite beautiful. And that brings me to this photograph, an image of a sculpture in a piazza in the marvelous walled Italian hill town of Lucca in northern Tuscany. And this image really, for me, completes this trio of three photographs of sentinels standing, sort of waiting for the action to occur. The idea here that it's possible to relate a tree to two sculptural images, and that the two sculptural images themselves are quite different in feel and look and quality, and the idea that the background in this photograph is quite dark. The background in the first photograph of the three image sequence is quite light, and the central photograph has this sort of foreboding quality, begins to set up a kind of a mood in the set of photographs. And if we begin to think about this in terms of the way in which we show people photographs, not only showing them photographs in, say, a portfolio situation where you're showing someone a group of images and you'd like them to get a sort of feeling from that group of images, but certainly part of what curators in galleries and museums do, whether you are the person who is hanging your work in a coffee shop or some other venue, or whether you are relying on the curator who is in charge of a gallery or a museum space to make these kinds of connections. And some of the more interesting conversations that I've had about my work have been with curators and gallerists who have been the people who kind of help me figure out relationships between images, and they bring a different eye to this. And one of the things that I think is quite valuable is looking at the idea of sequence and looking at the idea of how we put images together one after another, and that way in which that sequencing of images makes a difference in how we perceive the photographs, not only in terms of shape, but also in terms of idea or concept or emotional valence. So think about this, and maybe if you've got some some photo friends, some other photographer friends, or even people who aren't as familiar with photography and are people that you know, and set down a group of 4 or 5 or 6 images in front of someone and say, sequence these, put these together in an order that makes sense to you. And a really interesting set of conversations, I think, can occur when we begin to talk about how putting photographs together one after another changes not only the way in which we see them, but also changes the message that those photographs can deliver. And certainly the ideas of sequencing that we talked about with Minor White at the beginning of the episode here play out in a lot of different kinds of images. So take a look at the idea of sequencing photographs. Take a look at the idea of putting your pictures together in a way that makes sense to you as the photographer. Thanks again for listening to Camera Position. I really appreciate you being here, and I certainly appreciate those of you who have written in and let me know that you're out there. It's certainly terrific to hear from you, and do visit the Photocast Network and find some other photo podcasts that I think are pretty terrific, and I think you'll find that there is a lot of great content out there. And with that, I'd recommend that you go out and make some photographs and bring them back and edit them down to the essential elements of what it is that you've seen, and then sequence them and see what you can do with regard to changing the idea of how those photographs communicate the notions that you are interested in communicating. And thanks again for being here and for listening to Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography.
PhotocastNetwork.com, your photography resource in the podosphere. PhotocastNetwork.com